Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and I wanted to do a few animated battle maps before I start the large series of animations covering Jackson's Valley campaign in May. So I decided to animate the Battle of Fort Stedman, Lee's last offensive. Because of the Army of Northern Virginia coming to an end just a few weeks after this battle, reports are scarce, so historians have tried to reconstruct in what order the brigades and regiments maneuvered across the battlefield, but in many cases we just don't know, and historians still debate where various units were during the battle. I'm going to give you the best representation that I could construct using some of the best maps published. For 9 months, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant remained in a death grapple around Richmond and Petersburg, with Grant extending his lines to the west in order to cut off Lee's supply routes. With every available man that Lee could muster, the Army of Northern Virginia could barely field 57,000 men, but the effective count was much less. Grant possessed 120,000 men, perhaps more than all the Confederacy could effectively muster, just outside the fortifications of Richmond and Petersburg alone. On March 6, 1865, the London Times reported, President Davis once said that if Richmond were taken, the war could still be maintained for 20 years in Virginia alone, and the truth of the saying may soon be tested. It is now reported that the evacuation of Richmond is in contemplation, and that General Lee will transfer his command to Lynchburg. In the end, it is thought that Sherman may join Grant, and that the two armies may be joined into one, but if Lee is also joined by Beauregard, it is possible that his military genius may still give him the ascendancy. General Sherman was moving through the Carolinas and time was running out. With A.P. Hill on sick furlough the last couple of days of March, General Robert E. Lee turned to one of his youngest generals and his youngest corps commander, John B. Gordon, just 33 years old, but someone who had fought tenaciously during the entire war, including being wounded 5 times at Antietam. Lee wanted to know what his options were and asked Gordon. The young general pondered over it and gave Lee 3 options. 1. Negotiate a peace with Grant. 2. Abandon Richmond and unite Lee's Army of Northern Virginia with Joe Johnston's in North Carolina. Or, number 3. Attack the Federals without delay. Ultimately, these last 2 were linked. Lee could not defeat Grant outright with the numbers currently on the field, and Richmond would fall soon either way. Attacking the Federals and dealing them a significant enough blow may buy the Confederate Army enough time to pull out more safely and more intact. Lee told Gordon he would take these suggestions to the President. After a discussion with Jefferson Davis, the President refused to abandon the city, and suing for peace was out of the question without an assurance of Southern independence, which Lincoln rejected in his meeting with Vice President Alexander Stephens earlier in the year. Lee returned to Gordon. He stated, "There was but one thing that we could do, fight. To stand still was death." This statement was exacerbated by the fact that Lee received an urgent message from General Johnston in North Carolina stating, "Sherman's course cannot be hindered by the small force I have. I can do no more than annoy him. I respectfully suggest that it is no longer a question of whether you leave the present situation. You have only to decide where to meet Sherman." Lee tasked Gordon with devising a plan of attack to deal a devastating blow to the Union Army's left flank around Petersburg. On the Petersburg front, the trenches and fortifications of the two armies began on the east side of the city against the Appomattox River, where the two battle lines lay just a few hundred yards apart. As the lines extended westward, the trenches diverged, getting further away from one another, at some points more than 2 miles away from each other. Confederate and Union troops built forts along the entire line at intervals of 1/4 to 1/2 mile, with artillery batteries interspersed between them. Each side posted skirmishers out in front of their respective works to keep an eye on the enemy. Behind the Union lines laid a secondary line in case Confederates breached the first set of fortifications. Behind that laid a military railroad that ran from City Point, where the Union Army unloaded supplies from ships to railroad cars and sent them to the front. That railway and Meade Station, where the supplies disembarked, represented the veins of the Union Army, carrying life-sustaining supplies to the men on the front. Gordon consulted with one of his division commanders, Major General James A. Walker. He asked Walker if he thought his position at Colquitt Salient vulnerable. Walker said yes, the two sides being only 200 yards apart made it possible for Union troops to charge over his works and take him before he had enough time to prepare for such an assault. He also stated that the opposite was true. The Union works were so close that the proximity would allow him to assault the fortifications and get over the entrenchments before Union forces could act. On March 22nd, Lee and Gordon met, and Gordon informed him that, "I can take Fort Stedman, sir." Lee instructed Gordon to create a detailed plan for how to take the fort and the area around it. Fort Stedman lay just 200 yards from the Colquitt salient. The original structure allegedly had been built by members of the 17th South Carolina nearly 3 years prior when George McClellan's Army of the Potomac marched up the peninsula. It remained in Confederate hands until the opening stages of the Siege of Petersburg, when in mid-June 1864, Union attacks pushed the Confederates to their secondary lines, where they still remained. Union soldiers named it after Brevet Brigadier General Griffin A. Stedman of the 11th Connecticut Infantry. Stedman became mortally wounded about a month and a half after the capture of the fort. The close proximity to the Federal guns forced Confederate forces to construct an impressive network of fortifications at the Colquitt salient. 20 cannons guarded it, with a triple row of chevaux de frise. Behind it ran a road through a ravine that protected troops who would come to reinforce the area in case of a breakthrough. Fort Stedman, in contrast, was one of the weakest links in the Union line. An artillery officer described it as no fort in the engineering sense of the term, but a struggling work of no regular shape. Another officer said this about it: "It was a comparatively small work without bastions, covering about 3/4 of an acre of ground. In the fort and around it, in rear, was a grove of large shade trees. Its nearness to the enemy prevented even the slightest repairs." To the north of Fort Stedman laid works partially unfinished, also because of the nearness to the enemy. The nearest battery emplacement was a 1/4 mile away. 2 partially fortified hills with artillery behind Fort Stedman provided security to the weak fort. Meade Station lay just 2,200 yards in the rear of Fort Stedman. Occupying the entrenchments around Fort Stedman was the 9th Corps, led by Major General John G. Parke, who took over the corps after Ambrose Burnside got relieved after the debacle at the Crater. Parke's 1st Division, led by Orlando Wilcox, defended the works from Fort McGilvery against the Appomattox River to Battery 13, including Fort Stedman. One of Wilcox's brigade under Napoleon Bonaparte McLaughlin defended Fort Stedman itself with the 14th New York Heavy Artillery inside the fort, the 57th Massachusetts to the north, and the 29th Massachusetts to the south. Fewer than 2,000 men manned those works. In Grant's efforts to extend his line west, the fortifications nearest the Appomattox River to the east suffered from a lack of adequate manpower. The 9th Corps also gained a bad reputation from their part in the Battle of the Crater, so the works around Fort Stedman offered some of the elements required for success: close proximity to the enemy, flawed defenses, undermanned works, and a disrespected opponent. After Gordon's staff and Gordon himself examined the works to be captured, the Georgian constructed a plan. First, before dawn, a few select men would unchain the Confederate chevaux de frise and remove them from in front of the works to allow an open path to the Union fortifications. Then the pickets would move out and subdue the Union pickets by taking advantage of Grant's initiative to whittle away at Lee's forces by helping the men desert. The Union commander offered passage to the north and payment for their rifles if they became turncoats. In this way, the Confederate pickets could easily capture their Union counterparts by posing as Confederate deserters. Next, 50 men armed with axes would clear away any Union impediments. Then 300 men with unloaded rifles, using their bayonets and the butts of their rifles, would capture Fort Stedman. That completed the first phase. Phase 2 required deception. 3 groups, led by 1 officer each, would claim to be Union soldiers retreating from the captured Fort Stedman. Once in the works, they would then subdue the Union troops behind Fort Stedman. During the next phase, Gordon's division would move across the 200 yards to the Union works and open the breach wider, allowing Confederate cavalry to dash into the Union rear and disrupt communication as well as supplies. From there, Confederate infantry would press on to eliminate the Union regiments in a domino-like fashion. The entire 2nd Corps under Gordon and brigades from A.P. Hill's Corps and Richard Anderson's Corps would take part in this action. about 18,000 men, nearly half of the total effective men Lee possessed. Henry Heath commanded Hill's corps in Hill's absence and chose 4 brigades, those under John R. Cook, William Macomb, James H. Lane, and Edward Thomas, to aid in Gordon's attack, but because of their distance from the attack, they would arrive late. Lee attempted to get Pickett's division from Longstreet's corps to aid in the attack, but not enough rail cars could be organized to bring them to the field, significantly reducing that 18,000 men. Some historians estimate that barely 10,000 Confederate soldiers engaged the enemy during this battle. Bushrod Johnson's division, consisting of Matthew Ransom's North Carolinians and William H. Wallace's South Carolinians, would also assist Gordon in the attack. The attack was to commence on March 25th at dawn, so most of the men began assembling for the attack at dark on the 24th. By 4 a.m., Gordon's divisions were ready to launch their attack, even though the brigades from Heath and Wilcox's divisions had either not made it to the field or remained within the Confederate works. Ransom and Wallace's brigades from Johnson's divisions were in place to the left of Gordon's corps. The accounts vary as to how the attack was to be signaled. Either a single shot from a Confederate private signaled for the corps to go forward, or 3 pistol shots, fired in rapid succession by Gordon personally, let the men know to commence the attack. Either way, the 57th North Carolina, along with other units, advanced in front to capture the Union skirmishers through deception. Behind them were the 6th North Carolina, made up of men with axes to clear a way through for the infantry. Once the sharpshooters and skirmishers dealt with their Union counterparts, the pioneers went ahead and began to clear the route of obstructions. The Confederate brigades did not go unnoticed. Word got to Union lines that Confederate forces were forming for an attack, and thus the Union brigade commanders ordered their soldiers to take up arms, but with the short distance the Confederates had to march, the Federal troops could not get to Fort Stedman before it would fall into Confederate hands. With as many Union troops and obstacles neutralized as possible, the rest of the infantry began their attack. The darkness brought confusion to the battlefield, but the Union forces knew enough that the Confederates were attacking. Wallace and Ransom's brigades quickly took over Battery 10, and the brigades of Terry, Wagaman, and Casey's brigades captured Batteries 11 and 12, but the rest of Gordon's men became stuck outside Fort Stedman. A soldier in front of the fort said, "The wind from the cannon and the flying balls was so strong we could not keep our hats on," while the frightful roar of the guns drowned every other sound. Finally, the Confederate troops began to file to the right to a low point in the fortification and breached the fort, where hand-to-hand combat broke out between the two sides. Brigadier General McLaughlin entered the fort close to the time when the Southern troops had fully captured the work, and because the sun had yet not fully risen, he began giving orders to Confederate troops until they realized he was the enemy and captured him. The commotion at Fort Stedman alerted the garrisons of Battery No. 9 and Fort Haskell of the attack, and they began to throw artillery shells into the Confederates. Once the Confederates captured Fort Stedman, they fanned out to open a wide breach in the Union works. The 57th and 6th North Carolina proceeded past the first Union entrenchments, but they lost their guides who were to take them to the secondary set of Union entrenchments, and thus could not find the artillery emplacements in the darkness. When the Confederates fanned out, they hit stiff resistance, and with the brigades from Wilcox and Heath's division not leaving the confines of the Confederate fortifications, the attack began to stall. Gordon described the scene. "Up to this point, the success had exceeded my most sanguine expectations. We had taken Fort Stedman and a long line of breastworks on either side. We had captured 9 heavy cannon, 11 mortars, nearly 1,000 prisoners, including General McLaughlin, with the loss of less than half a dozen men. I was in the fort myself and relieved General McLaughlin by assuming command of Fort Stedman. General John G. Parke sent word to General Meade's headquarters informing him of the attack and requested support. He received a message back at 6:10 a.m. stating that General Meade was not there and that Parke would need to basically get his own reinforcements. Meade and his wife accepted the invitation of Grant to spend some time at City Point with him and the President, who came to visit the scene of the siege. That morning, Meade was still on a steamboat docked in the James River. The word went out to all available commanders to converge on Fort Stedman. Parke attempted to send a telegraph to City Point informing Grant and Meade of the attack, but some of Gordon's men made it into the rear of the Union lines and cut the telegraph line linking Parke to City Point. To the north, Ransom's brigade pushed back the 57th Massachusetts. Most of the men from the old Bay State were in their tents when the attack began. Officers rushed their troops to counter the Confederate brigade, but the momentum was in the Southerners' favor. Before Ransom's men could push on to Battery 9, the 2nd Michigan mounted a counterattack that Ransom's men could not withstand and fell back toward Fort Stedman. The 20th Michigan, 1st Michigan Sharpshooters, and 50th Pennsylvania came to the aid of the Michiganders. When the 6th and 57th North Carolina approached Fort Friend, a blast of artillery roared and a shell burst in their midst, killing 2 members of the color guard. Wilcox got word to the commanders of the 200th and 209th Pennsylvania regiments to come to his aid, which they promptly did, helping to contain the Confederate breakthrough. The 200th Pennsylvania and a reformed 57th Massachusetts began pushing back against the Confederate skirmishers. Ransom launched an aggressive counterattack of his own, driving back the Federals in the process. However, the situation was becoming desperate, with no support coming to Gordon's beleaguered troops. Ransom pulled back his brigade and they started to dig in to protect themselves from shot and shell. South at Fort Haskell, the troops there, placed in readiness by their officer when he received a premonition of an impending battle, were in their entrenchments and ready for an attack before the attack took place. Thus, they were prepared for Gordon's large assault. Terry's brigade of Evans' division pressed south, rolling up the Union entrenchments, but encountered stiff resistance at Haskell. Although the Union troops there were prepared, it became a scene of great chaos and bravery as rebel sharpshooters showered the fort with bullets and the Union troops inside valiantly fired back. The wounded and sick Federal troops loaded muskets and handed them to the able-bodied soldiers to fire at the enemy. The situation became more dire for the Federals when Union artillery pieces began discharging rounds into Haskell, thinking it captured by Confederates. The commander of the 14th New York Heavy Artillery, Major George M. Randall, captured by Confederates in the initial assault, escaped from his captors with the battery's colors wrapped around him. It was daylight, and Randall grabbed 8 men to form a color guard and marched to the rear of the fort and waved the flag to signal that the batteries to the rear were firing on their own men. 4 men were wounded, 1 mortally, in that makeshift color guard before the friendly fire stopped. Although the Federals stopped the Confederates from capturing Fort Haskell, the battle still raged in that sector. One Union soldier wrote, "With this, the aggressive spirit of that famous movement melted away forever. The sortie was a failure, and daylight found the invaders stalled in the breach. The Confederate problem of the day was reduced to the silencing of Haskell, and it was the target of more guns than had been concentrated upon one point during the siege. Here, for once, after all the prosy months of stupid carnage, was the realization of the grand and terrible in the war." The situation became pure chaos for Gordon's Confederates. The small Fort Stedman, only capable of housing around 300 men, now contained thousands of Confederates. Gordon attempted to organize them to push on to the east in order to capture the forts in the secondary Union line, but many refused to go, too scared to venture out of the entrenchments they worked so hard to capture. When Gordon realized that Haskell could not be taken, he knew the assault needed to be called off and requested such from Lee. Lee gave his consent to withdraw from the Federal works. By this point, Federal officers coordinated their regiments to basically form an arc around Fort Stedman, and 30 pieces of artillery delivered devastating volleys into the fort. Gordon watched around him as soldiers tried in vain to fight back against the Federal infantry and artillery. Bullets and shells picked off soldiers exposed on the outside of the works, and those behind the walls grew too afraid to expose themselves to enemy fire in an attack. It was about 7:30 a.m. when the Union soldiers began to reclaim their works. Batteries 11 and 12 were some of the first fortifications to be recaptured by Union forces. The noose began to tighten around the Confederates, struggling to hold on to Fort Stedman. Small groups of soldiers, either wounded or dismayed by the attack, began to stream back to Colquitt's salient. The night before the attack, Captain Joseph Carson in Cook's brigade prepared his sharpshooters for the upcoming attack. While doing that, his 18-year-old brother Bob, a courier, wanted to follow him into battle. Joseph reminded him that the war already took their other 2 brothers, and as the youngest, their father needed Bob in his old age. Bob was not dissuaded and joined his brother. As the Confederate line began its retreat from Fort Stedman, Joseph noticed his own overcoat covering a lifeless body. Joseph gave the coat to Bob the night before to shield him from the cold. Under the coat laid Bob's body. Joseph and one of his soldiers lifted up the body on their shoulders and carried him back to Confederate lines near Colquitt Salient. Neither Joseph nor the other soldier got hit returning to the lines, but the lifeless body received 4 more bullet wounds during the retreat. The Union regiments pressed closer to the beleaguered Confederates as Union artillery shells screamed through the sky and burst over Fort Stedman. Gordon received word to retreat and sent word to his brigades and divisions. Gordon and his men made it back to the Confederate entrenchments, but while taking stock, Gordon found out that the 49th North Carolina still remained, isolated from the other regiments. They did not realize Gordon had given orders to withdraw. A courier volunteered to take them the message and lead the regiment back to safety. The journey back across the ground between the two battle lines took its toll on the Tar Heels. An officer in that regiment wrote, "Good God, what a time! It seemed as if the enemy's artillery opened and redoubled vigor and the Minnie balls came in showers. Many were wounded, and as their unhurt comrades passed them, would beg piteously to be carried out. The hearts of many failed them, and they did not start at all. Others started but took shelter in the picket trenches and covered ways. Lieutenant Crowder and the men who were carrying him were overtaken and captured by the enemy. At 8 a.m., the 9th Corps announced that they recaptured Fort Stedman. The horrible fight was over." Barely 30 minutes after the fighting ended, a Confederate delegation led by Henry Kidd Douglas, now commanded the Stonewall Brigade, went into the battlefield under a flag of truce to collect the wounded and dead. It took 30 more minutes before General Parke agreed to send his own delegation, still thinking an attack could be made, but decided against it. His delegation was led by General Hartranft. Hartranft and Douglas found out in their conversation that they attended the same college, and that began their lifelong friendship. Both sides, but mostly Confederates, crossed the works and retrieved their dead. Union and Confederate soldiers also met during the truce to trade goods and talk. Many Southerners did not return to their lines when the truce ended. When all the bodies were counted, the Union lost 70 killed, 424 wounded, and 523 missing, for a total of 1,017. The Confederacy's numbers could not be accurately totaled because of the breakdown of the reporting system so close to the Army surrender, but the numbers vary from 1,900 to 2,600 total casualties. The failed attack on Fort Stedman signaled to Grant that if Lee marshaled that many troops for an assault, other portions of the Confederate line grew weaker, that now was the time to attack. Over the course of the next couple days, Grant assembled his attacking force to dislodge Lee from Petersburg and Richmond. The attack on Fort Stedman was Lee's last offensive.